two-part series brought to you by Cloudsmith called DevOps Disruptors. I'm Glenn Weinstein. I'm the CEO here at Cloudsmith. I'll be joined in a few moments by two very esteemed experts in this topic, and we're going to have a great discussion. It's actually a three-part webinar series, as I mentioned, so you can register for the whole series. We'll be streaming the series on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and on dev.to. To register for the series, just head on over to cloudsmith.com, or also you can scan the QR code that's currently on your screen, and you can join us for all three sessions. But today will be the introductory session, and we're really going to lay the groundwork for what platform engineering is and why we think it may be a disruptive trend to the topic we all know and love as DevOps. More specifically, the catalyst for this webinar series was a recently published report by the analyst firm Omdia entitled Market Disruptors: Moving from Platform Engineering Does Not Mean the End of DevOps. And we're going to get into this report, and we're going to debate some of the points that the authors have raised. I would summarize that report. A couple of my key takeaways from Omdia's report were, first of all, that DevOps is necessary but not sufficient to meet the challenges of multimodal IT. And when teams today are choosing their own tools, they're inhibiting internal collaboration. Omdia also argues that developers face more challenges today than when DevOps first emerged around 2009. Specifically, we're deploying to containers now. We're deploying to Kubernetes environments. We're pulling a lot more open source software than we ever have, and we're expecting the developers to manage the security risks and synthesize an incredibly complex chain of tools just to build anything, to get anything done, and to actually write any code. Omdia, in this white paper, predicts that platform engineering is an emerging organizational approach that aims to solve some of these challenges. So on that note, I'd like to welcome in our panelists. So I'll start with co-founder and chief strategy officer right here at Cloudsmith, Alan Carson. Welcome, Alan.
Thanks, Glenn. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. I also want to welcome to this webinar Luca Galante, VP of Product and Growth at Humanitech. Hi, Luca.
Hey, Glenn. Hey, Alan. Good to be here.
Pleasure to have both of you. So I think you're the right two panelists to kick off this webinar series and talk about what we're really seeing companies and large organizations do around how they've implemented DevOps principles in the last decade or so, and what they may be thinking about in terms of platform engineering, or maybe a migration or an evolution of what we mean by DevOps or what we mean by platform engineering. So Luca, I'd like to start with you from your perch as head of product and growth at Humanitech. What is actually happening? What is literally happening? What are you seeing organizations that build and develop software starting to do? Are they really starting to build a department called platform engineering?
Yes, correct. They are, and there's an increasing number of organizations that are going down the platform engineering route, especially in the enterprise, mid-size to large-size enterprises. They're really, I think, waking up to the fact that DevOps is a great idea in theory, but there has some scaling issue, so to say. And I think to understand that, it's helpful to take a quick walk maybe down memory lane. DevOps was kind of a response to this idea of, this like bad practice of just throwing code over the fence, right? And you had some like poor sysadmin person down in the basement that was crazily enough, like actually buying the physical servers and do the networking. And then on top of that, had to figure out, okay, how do I run this code that they're just throwing at me? And so then like early 2000s, this idea of like, hey, if you build it, you should also be responsible for running it, was kind of like really popularized in the industry. And I think from my perspective, it is interesting that, if you look at virtually any industry in the world since the 1800s, when we had the kind of like the assembly line and Henry Ford and so on, the trend has been towards specialization, except for software engineering, where at some point we thought it was a great idea that just like, hey, everybody does everything.
All right. So you're saying that DevOps emerged to solve a problem, which is this throwing software over the fence, but it brought its own problems, which is it forced everybody to be a generalist.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like a bad word to say separation of concerns, I think, today in the industry. And I disagree with that. I'm a huge advocate for that. I do think that you need different teams doing different things, and you need a development team that builds features and products. You need a infrastructure and operations team that maintains the infrastructure that those products are deployed and running on. And then you need a platform team to actually build some sort of layer in between those two teams.
Okay, so you're not advocating for a return to the bad old days. Let me actually ask that in more pointed kind of a way, Luca. Like, are the principles that led to the rise of DevOps still true today, or is that just an obsolete way of looking at the world?
No, very much so. I think they're still very alive, and to to the point of the report that you mentioned in the opening, I think platform engineering is not any type of sort of like DevOps killer, is really an evolution of DevOps that actually enables true DevOps at scale in the cloud native era. Cloud native / hybrid, whatever you want to call it. But the point is, this DevOps, the original idea of DevOps works if you're like a few tens of people, everybody's very familiar with your tool chain, then it's fine. You can actually do real DevOps. The problem is if you have like hundreds or thousands of developers and you have a very complex tool chain, it's really not realistic to expect your latest hire, i.e. some junior front end, to come in and be familiar with your tool chain end to end and be able to do things. Instead, they'll be blocked, they'll end up waiting, and they'll end up basically creating a bottleneck of tickets for their ops colleagues, or for other more senior developers that will end up doing just like shadow operations, right? And the first companies to realize this were sort of like the leading tech companies and advanced engineering organizations like the Spotifys, the Googles, the Airbnbs, who basically looked at this and we're like, okay, I mean, DevOps sounds great in theory, but in practice, I'm onboarding like literally hundreds of developers a month to this like crazy, complex setup that is increasingly complex. And I can't expect them to all be knowledgeable about everything. So I just need to build some sort of platform layer. And they were the first to do platform engineering. That's been sort of trickling down to smaller teams and less advanced organizations.
That's interesting. So just the same way that some of the larger tech companies pioneered a lot of technology that has grown into open source projects that we all have come to know and love and adopt, they've also pioneered this kind of organizational structural change, observing that DevOps kind of has some flaws or some challenges at scale.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So Alan, you and Lee Skillen, our other co-founder here at Cloudsmith, you started the company really in the earlier days of the DevOps era. Who were the first customers that you sold Cloudsmith to, and were they DevOps teams, or what did you see back, I guess, in the mid 2010s?
Yeah, well, there was a bit of a mixture. I think like ultimately. When you think about it, DevOps is enablement, and and removing the constraints that are there to really build out automation. And so it did get a little bit, I suppose, perverted in terms of like how it was actually rolled out in terms of away from the concepts. And so what we started to see, and sort of in that time frame, was teams coming in, sort of small teams coming in, trying to sort of build out automation, and then larger enterprises, which were maybe trying to put the genie back in the box a little bit in terms of like that kind of let their development teams sort of build on technologies, whatever technologies they wanted, and so they were sort of disparate, different languages and different CI/CD tools, and wanted to start kind of consolidating that together. And one of the earliest companies that we saw was MyOB in Australia, who came in, and they had I think 50 developer teams. And
this is a decent sized software company making financial, like a financial product.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and they had that problem, but they had set up a sort of DevOps operation, which, when you think about it, is really what we're talking about here in terms of platform engineering. But to kind of start picking the tools that would ultimately start to consolidate a lot of those processes um, into a sort of a streamlined view of what was happening within their organization. And again, from the sort of you know the DevOps side of it, like, observability was one of sort of the key factors that the sort of it promoted. And I mean, if you start to consolidate in terms of like the tools that you have, all your information is flowing into, a finite set of tools, you start to get that observability coming
Mhm.
back out.
All right. So you're starting to get into one of the two problems that both you and Luca have identified with the original DevOps principles, which are the inability to scale past a few tens of developers, I think you said, Luca. And then, Alan, you're describing this kind of mess of different tools that have been selected, different CI/CD tools, different developer tools, that lead to like a lack of integration or lack of observability. So, first of all, are those the right problems that we're talking about solving with platform engineering?
Yeah, I think the from the ops perspective, yeah, having to maintain this like growing amount of tooling, and then also
Mhm.
at the same time while trying to balance the different preferences of different dev teams, right? So you have like dev team A that like wants to use Jenkins and then this other thing, and then dev team B that wants to use like GitHub Actions and then this other thing, and so on. Like that
Yeah.
becomes like really unwieldy really quickly. But I think
Mhm.
like the actual pain points in terms of what platform engineering is aiming at, I would say, are enabling developer self-service. So the lack of self-service, the fact that developers are just like waiting and kind of stuck,
Yeah.
and they have to face this constant sort of like increase in cognitive load in handling all these things. And then the flip side of that, which is just this huge flow of ticket ops for ops teams that constantly need to like put out fires and become an organizational bottleneck.
Mhm.
And what that also becomes is then a this like constantly manual configuration and ad hoc solutions, and just like
Mhm.
a general lack of standardization and scalability. So those, I'd say those are the two sides of the coin
I
that
see.
platform engineering tries to address.
Okay, so you mentioned developer self-service. This, I remember when AWS was first introduced. Not to age myself, but this idea that you could just request a server and 2 minutes later you had a server, instead of 2 weeks later. That was the original notion of self-service in the cloud. But you're taking it to a different level. You're basically saying, well, I should be able to self-serve my tool set, my stack, my integration of those tools should be available through self-service. So we're starting to describe, I think, kind of what platform engineering is. Is platform engineering basically a product? Is it the ability to offer a product to your internal customers, your internal developers? And if so, what's the product exactly?
Yeah, correct. So I mean,
Mhm.
platform engineering is really like a discipline, right? That you can think of as basically taking this like tech and tools that you have floating around, especially in the enterprise, and effectively binding them together into golden paths that enable developer self-service, right? And then the sum of these golden paths is the end product of the platform engineering initiative, which is an internal developer platform, or IDP for short, which is really this like platform layer that, to your point, the platform team builds as a product, right? So like in the platform engineering community, there's always a lot of conversation around platform as a product as one of the like core principles of platform engineering, which I also think is what ultimately differentiates a SRE, cloud ops, DevOps meant in the traditional way from a platform engineer, because earlier you were really there to effectively add infrastructure, maintain the infrastructure, make sure that infrastructure was available and scalable and so on, and and effectively kind of like teach developers about the infrastructure, whereas the and again, we've gone into why that's not really scalable. Whereas the platform engineer job is to take that infrastructure and package it into a self-serviceable platform layer that effectively abstracts all the complexities. So the developer doesn't really need to understand unless they want to. And then there's a whole conversation around kind of like golden path versus golden cages and how much you abstract versus how much context you provide. But that's a
Yeah.
separate thing.
I want to get into that actually, but let's stick with just for the moment really the definition of what platform engineering is. You made some great points here, Luke. You basically distinguish it from SRE or other types of operational teams that you're really describing a true, somewhat unique product that didn't exist 10 years ago. Is there something unique or did something change because the way we develop in the cloud today, provisioning cloud resources that just, I guess, increase the urgency for the need for something like platform engineering? Would platform engineering have emerged if we didn't have AWS and Azure and the Google Cloud Platform?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think so eventually, but it certainly there was certainly like an accelerated need for that because as we said, like I think that the two vectors that really drove this this like leading tech companies to the realization like, hey, this is not working. Like one was the just sheer size of the engineering org. Like I mean, AWS itself, I think when they launched was like 300 engineers, right? So like very small, like compared to like what we have today, right? So that literally like that organization literally 100x or so, right? Like two orders of magnitude. And at the same time, you had all the enterprises that 20 years ago, I don't think like McDonald's and Ford really had a ton of in-house developers. Maybe they had a few and like they were working. Now they all have their own engineering shops and they're pretty big, right? So that was one vector. But then the other vector, to your point, is just like, look at the CNCF landscape, right? It's just like, it's crazy. And you
cloud
have all
native,
this,
the cloud native computing framework.
exactly,
CNCF.
cloud native computing foundation, and it has, I don't know, like maybe thousands of different tools, right, to pick from. And you have all these like overlapping trends like containerization, microservice architectures, Kubernetes, IAC, infrastructure as code, like all this like complexity layers that added on top of each other to make obviously people's life easier. But when you combine all of them, it can be quite tricky to navigate.
Yeah, you just hit on three things: containerization, Kubernetes, and infrastructure as code. That really, those essentially, I think, didn't exist 15 years ago. Each of those, and have just added to the complexity stack that modern developers face. Alan, Cloudsmith came in to the market as a cloud native tool itself. Do you think that I guess do you see a similar evolution in the way that customers are adopting tooling for larger software organizations? That there's this movement towards creating a product that self-service that developers can self-serve. I mean, did you see that? Did you see the opposite of that in the early days of Cloudsmith? And do you see today Cloudsmith customers kind of consuming tooling in a different way?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with Luca. I mean, I think ultimately there's just a vast amount of choice, of tooling that's available, and that, and I think if you let large development teams at that level of choice, you're just going to get a different result every single time. So ultimately, building in guardrails into, how you, build your technology stack is sort of vital so that you get, a coherent ability to write and deploy your own software. And so, as every company is a software company, like Luca mentioned, like ultimately that becomes an important thing. Now, in terms of like where Cloudsmith sits in that stack, like we have 30 different formats, and like typically it's about 7 or 8 different formats per large enterprise using it, and no two are the same for everybody just has built software in a slightly different way. And so it's really about trying to form fit the way that people want to approach the problem with the tooling that they have, and ultimately that ends up being part of the problem and the challenge, and finding the right tools that fit into solving that is the sort of the key driver.
Well, you're raising a really interesting point, Alan. You talked about 30 formats, or maybe average organization, 8 forms. But by formats, we're talking about languages. We're talking about the way that you literally build your software. And I think it's an important distinction to make. I don't think we're saying that platform engineering means get everybody on Python. I assume we're kind of recognizing, hey, the world is heterogeneous. It's probably going to stay that way, different languages, different strengths. But it is talking about trying to get developers who are writing in different formats to at least use a common tool set. Is that a fair way to break it down, Luca?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really about building, I guess, like this paved roads, right, for developers. So like you can have your different preferences and so on, but you need to consolidate and you need to standardize more than anything, right? It's really about driving standardization by design across your entire engineering setup. And that, you mentioned earlier, like this original idea of like, hey, you have the console, like I just self-serve things, right? But that's also part of the thing. Like when you build an internal developer platform as an enterprise org, you wanna have a clear way for developers to do that, right? That is not like, hey, you're free to do anything. It's just like, no, there's like this like clear golden path for you to follow, because we see really like platform engineering is especially sought after in regulated industries. Like those are the ones that immediately get the value, because you not only have the ops teams looking at this and be like, oh, this is going to make my life a lot easier, but you also have the security teams are looking at this and like, hey, I can actually enforce all sorts of like policies and governance things automatically through the platform.
That's a pretty wide swath of companies, actually. You talk about regulated or semi-regulated. So, okay, so you said paved roads. That's a great visual of what platform engineering is actually providing. Let's talk about that a little bit. Last I checked, developers don't always do what the corporate mandate says, or at least they don't willingly do it. You've got to provide a little bit more kind of like of an attraction to get developers to agree to do something different. So what we've talked about in the first part of this podcast or webinar is great, but how do you actually get developers to adopt these standard platforms that platform engineering is putting out, or these paved roads? Isn't that part of the challenge? I mean, by definition, we're talking about pretty large organizations, right? Hundreds of developers. How do you get all those teams to agree to this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is actually the key question and the key challenge in the platform engineering space is how do you roll out a successful platform engineering initiative, because you need to convince all those different stakeholders, right? You have like application developers that you mentioned, but you also have the security teams that we said earlier. You have the existing infrastructure and operations team. You have architects. You have CCOE, like the Cloud Center of Excellence. You have the executives. It's crazy, right? And the problem is that I see a lot of platform engineering initiatives fail because they try to convince everybody at the same time. Like, the Everything Everywhere All at Once movie. It's like that, where it's like you need to like person
It's a
A,
pretty
B,
chaotic
C,
movie.
D.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
was very
I
stressful.
mean, it
to
looks
watch.
like that in the end, right? Because you get to person Z, and it's been 6 months, right? And person A completely forgot about you, and it's like it's so easy to lose the momentum, which is why I think so much of platform engineering is actually about frameworks and processes, and like how do you drive this org transformation across the different stakeholder groups. And so, to your point, you can start with the application developers if that's like the key stakeholder group that you want to focus on first. And there, I think it's really about, well, how do you provide something that's 10x better than the current state? And I will say, sounds like, whoa, 10x better, but actually the current state is really bad in most cases, right? It's like in enterprise organizations, you need to wait for like 2 or 3 weeks to get a database or an environment spun up for you, right? So, to do something that's self-serviceable and where maybe restricts a little bit your way of roaming around, but it actually provides you something right away, is much better. And also, I mean, I think it's also about like, again, how do you roll that out across different teams? Where do you start? you usually want to start with a pretty experienced team that is not afraid of testing out new things, but is also like quite familiar with your entire stack. Because if you can make them happy, usually the maybe less experienced teams will be very happy very quickly, because they're the ones that want to deal even less with infrastructure and all these things, right? They just want to deploy a change or anything.
Yeah.
Right.
Luca, do you think like culturally things will change over the next, 5 to 10 years, where the people that are happy in kind of having it all set up will gravitate towards large enterprises, and those that want to pick their tools, will go to startups and small businesses?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because it is very much like a cultural. I mean, I think there's a few trends, right? Like we spoke about this like trend of like the against specialization. There's also, I think, a really interesting like um, sort of like job market point to be made, that is, you have in the last 20 years, there's been a huge shortage of developers. So developers really have been able to be the prima donnas of like, hey, I want to do ABC, whereas which hasn't happened in a lot of other industries. And and to your point, then you have the cultural layer on top. Like I see platforms, for instance, being developed and adopted in places like Brazil are different than in places like San Francisco, right? Because culturally in Brazil, you have much more of a hierarchical culture. And so platforms are just imposed and nobody even questions that. And it just makes their life better for everybody. Whereas in, and yeah, there is an element of like, oh, I'm a little bit more abstracted away, and oh, like I need to find my developer engineer dignity somewhere else, maybe. But at the end of the day, like from an org perspective, it makes a lot more sense. Whereas you definitely have this like flatter hierarchical cultures, where it's like, no, don't take away my freedom of like messing around with Helm charts.
You're describing, I don't want to overstate, but you're describing potentially a pretty profound advance, I think, in the art of software engineering. I think for 30 years, we as an industry have hoped to make software engineering an engineering discipline, where there's some guarantee of quality and there's some standards that professionals follow. And I think we all know software engineering is fallen really well short of those standards. You can't trust a piece of software like you can trust a bridge not to collapse, or a building not to fall down. But maybe this is kind of like a step in the right direction of saying that there is it's okay actually to have standards and standard tool set. It doesn't restrict your creativity. If anything, I think true artisans will say that constraints actually kind of advanced creativity. Am I barking up the right tree here, guys? Do you think? Is this an advance in the overall art of software engineering?
I think so. I mean, everything's an evolution in software. So, like I think we've been on the path, and DevOps was, at the beginning was very much a stake in the ground to basically say, hey, methodologies need to be better. You need to think about automation and how that builds in. And I think this is sort of the natural evolution of where you're going to. I think it maybe makes a bit more both economic sense for large organizations, I think they think in teams, maybe, and so like to give a team a responsibility rather than to give the entire software organization a global responsibility. I think it does ultimately, in some ways, go back to the past, but sort of take the good parts of the past and sort of bring them forward.
Right. Okay. So let me. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Luca.
No, I was just gonna add that there's definitely this I think like tragedy of the commons, where like from an org perspective, this makes a lot of sense, but from the individual agent perspective, it's like, why would I do this? Like sometimes it's just like, well, I'm much better like building building a entire platform from scratch instead of adopting things like Cloudsmith and Humanitech. Like you see, like especially because it's still so early platform engineering, you see these people that are trying to like build the entire thing, right? Like you would never go and like build your Kubernetes from scratch, right? Like you're just like you take right, but because it's new, there you still have this tendency of like people that are like, well, I'm better off personally from my career perspective to just do that, or from the app dev perspective, I already have a platform. It's just called Bob. I just Slack Bob, and Bob does it for me. So like, why would I bother changing, right? And it's just like, well, because an org level, it's better. But then you need, and so that's I think the tricky thing about platform engineering, which is really this like cultural transformation that needs to speak to each different stakeholder group and their vested interests, and make sure that you get everybody on board. But again, the point is, don't try to get everybody on board at the same time. Just focus on one group first, and then kind of expand from there.
All right, let's talk about that a little bit, Luca. You've kind of thrown out I don't know, I guess an extreme where pushing back seems silly, like I just want to have my own tools. But where's a reasonable pushback? Like developers don't want everything abstracted away, right? If you give them a completely turnkey set of tools where they're too abstracted from what's actually happening under the hood, they don't like that either, right? So what's the right what's the reasonable compromise? How abstract should a IDP be, an internal developer platform?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you play this asymptotically, like in 10, 15 years, you will have everything abstracted because it just makes sense. And I mean, that's the history of software engineering, is just building abstraction on top of abstraction, right? So like you will get there eventually. I think the question again is culture, like who gets there first and why. And but so to your point, like right now, you really need to just navigate, and it highly depends on what your culture is in engineering org, and what your developers need, and what the trade-offs there are. And this is really the art of platform engineering, right? Because um and also why the only way to get an internal developer platform is to build one. And this is something that sometimes people are confused about, because they're just like, oh, I can just buy my IDP. No, like that's called a PaaS, or platform as a service. And you're effectively outsourcing this compromise that you're talking about to an external product team that will have itself compromise between you and all their other customers, right? So that's the key difference to like when you're doing platform engineering, you're building an internal developer platform to fit the needs of your own organizations. Now, again, I do think over time these differences will flatten out, and I think even today, in most cases, everybody thinks they're a special snowflake. When you really start digging into the details, they're not. Like there's always the same three ways of configuring a Postgres, and there's all these things that are like very, very similar org to org. But you really cannot tell them that yet. So it's just like we're in the middle of the transformation still, I think.
That's okay. I'm not asking us to see 10, 15 years in the future. I think 3 to 5 years will more than suffice. So Alan, I want to kind of come back to a couple of earlier points that we covered. Like, do you agree, or do you believe that DevOps, the underlying principles of DevOps are necessary but not sufficient, or do you think there's something wrong with DevOps? Basically, is there something inherently wrong with it?
No, I mean, I think the concepts of DevOps were the correct thinking. It's the removal of bottlenecks. It's the theory of constraints. It's there was a lot of good in there that was trying to like unblock organizations in the way that they were thinking and how that they were implementing things. I think given the fact that you have this explosion of cloud native tools, you have huge cloud providers providing a huge amount of technology. I think like it's hard to build a complete software stack with 2 people. It's very hard to do it with hundreds, because ultimately when you try to scale it, and we've had this in Cloudsmith, like we started with 2 or 3 people and sort of trying to build out a global distribution stack on AWS. Like there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of different technologies in there, and but like once you get it to a certain stage, you have to start, expanding and bringing more people in, and you get to a point where you can have a massive team. You get to a point where you don't want everybody having to do everything, because everything gets sort of slowed down because everybody has to learn every individual piece, and you want to kind of break that apart and give people everything to support them and help them do the thing that you need them to do.
Well, you're making the argument now for platform engineering, but I want to come back to where I was heading with that question was like, basically, are there prerequisites to rolling out a platform engineering initiative? Because Luca, you hinted a few times on this webinar that, hey, this pretty early days, right? Teams are at various points of their maturity, meaning there's a lot of shops that are not particularly mature. Is there a prerequisites? Can every listener of this webinar, should they all go and create platform engineering teams, or how do you know that your organization is ready?
I mean, I'd say if you're more than 100, couple hundred developers, you're probably just running into all these problems that we talked about, right? And the thing is, if I heard this line a while ago that was quite interesting, because it said like, if you're not, I don't remember, but if you're not building your platform, it's building itself. It was better than this, but the point is, right, that if you're not doing it consciously, you're not taking platform engineering, as an initiative internally, you'll have somebody that somehow is building some sort of, patchwork solution, because that's what engineers do, right? Like they'll realize there is some sort of problem and they want to automate it and they want to standardize it. The problem is, again, that if you just approach this from a technical perspective and not from a cultural perspective, you're bound to fail. / you're bound to have to scrap everything and start again from scratch, which is frankly, interestingly, then one of the also main challenges of new platform engineering initiatives is that they're coming up against whatever legacy platform-ish thing has been built before. And and then you have all these people that are invested in it emotionally, economically. Sometimes they've already invested maybe a lot of FTE time and some actual hard money into this, and so they're pushing back. So yeah, that's I think
really good
one
point.
of the other interesting thing.
Not a lot of green fields out there for 100+ person developer shops. But let me be more pointed about my question, or I guess what I'm trying to get, which is, is everybody good at DevOps? Are there software organizations that aren't even doing the basics, like developers not involved actually in deploying code or building code? I would presume that just sort of DevOps fundamental principles are a necessary prerequisite to platform engineering, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe organization can kind of skip ahead and just go straight from being primitive to going right to platform engineering. Does this make sense if you're not even doing some basic DevOps principles, I guess?
I'm trying to articulate the answer there. I don't think it's as simple as that, right? Because ultimately, anybody who's building software or doing 100 different tasks, and and one of them is writing code, and one of them is is broken down into various different things that they're doing in order to deploy that software. So the methodology of DevOps ultimately leans into trying to build those functions out. I think even for small teams that are not hundreds of developer engineers, it is sort of separation of concerns, and it's not unlikely that you have a person or a team or people that are putting a bit more specialization into, some of the tooling choices, maybe not all of them, and ultimately how you go about deploying that software. So I don't think it's a binary 1 or 0. I think there's a big gray area that you can kind of build upon in there. And it starts, from the cultural side of things, of just trying to get everybody on the same page. If you can get 15 people on the same page, you can do it with 100.
Yeah, that is not easy. Hard to get two people on the same page. So I want to summarize what I think we are talking about, or what we've said today, or what we've agreed upon. We've agreed, and feel free to jump in and correct me if you think I've got it wrong, that we've agreed that DevOps was necessary but not sufficient. Platform engineering is an evolution of some of those ideas, and it was brought on, or the need for that has been accelerated by the complexity of modern day, particularly modern day hyperscale cloud development, and the trends like containerization, Kubernetes, things like that, Terraform. And I think we've also basically said, listen, the core of what a platform engineering team does is it provides an internal developer platform, making some choices on behalf of developers so that everybody doesn't have to be a generalist in everything. And we can go back to the natural course of human evolution, which is increasing specialization, which actually, generally speaking, accelerates productivity. Is that kind of a good summary? What would you add to that, Luca?
Hey, man, pretty good.
I just love the Henry Ford analogy. They're like, we all thought that was a good thing, but except for in software, somehow we've managed to think we're different. Yeah, Alan, anything you'd add to that summary?
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive. You know, ultimately, you know, there's lots of places to start, and whether you're a big company or a small company, and I think it's just making the decision to start trying to think about how you would consolidate and get everybody onto the same page.
And Luca, what percentage of large software organizations, and let's define large as 100 developers or so, or more, what percentage of them do you think have a team today that's either called platform engineering or is doing platform engineering?
Yeah, hard to say. I would say probably like 20-30%, something like that.
Wow.
Gartner predicts that by 2026, you'll have about I think 80% of enterprise engineering organizations that will have some form of platform engineering initiative going, and I think that's you know, pretty much accurate. I'm very curious to see how the whole space will evolve. I can already see, you know, we've been hosting PlatformCon now for 3 years, and you can already see that the level of the conversation maturing year over year is really exponential. Like I think the space, the industry is really hungry for standards, for blueprints, and for clear like how-tos in terms of frameworks and processes, and they're all those things are emerging and are happening. So I do think it's moving really quickly, and I'm hoping that it will not fall into the same trap as DevOps, actually, where it kind of ended up meaning a little bit of everything and a little bit of nothing, and actually staying on track to be quite definite.
Well, that's a dramatic. We're in the throes of a dramatic transformation of what you say is true. We're going from 20 to 30% to 70-80% in a 2-year period. That means there will many people in their software and their organizations are going to see a pretty big reorganization taking place. It's a big prediction. Let's come back in 2 years and do this webinar again. Once again, Alan Carson, co-founder, chief strategy officer at Cloudsmith, and Luca Galante, VP of product and growth at Humanitech. Thank you guys for your insights into platform engineering. It's been a very educational conversation for me. Another reminder, this was the first in a 3-part webinar series. We're going to go even deeper into some of the specifics around platform engineering in the next 2 webinars. You can register for the whole series at cloudsmith.com or scan the QR code on your screen. We'll be streaming on LinkedIn, Twitter, and dev.to. Finally, I'm Glenn Weinstein. I'm the CEO here at Cloudsmith and a passionate software developer tools guy. And this is a super interesting topic. Thanks again, guys, for a really healthy conversation. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you in a week, August 7th, for the 2nd webinar. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right.